Okay, cool. Just double checking you can see the presentation still.
Yeah, it's still
Yeah.
there.
Okay, cool. Um, cool. Yeah, good morning and yeah, welcome. Thanks for joining us for our official relaunch of the Overexposed campaign. Um, oh, yeah, to introduce myself. My name is Ruby Cardona. I'm the communications manager at Chance for Childhood. Um, I'm joined today by Lucy Rollington, who's a child rights consultant and helped us out on launching the campaign originally and now in its next phase as well. And we're also joined by Richard Opoku, who is our inclusion and safeguarding lead at Chance for Childhood and also our senior programs manager in Ghana. Um, yeah. A little bit about Chance for Childhood. So we are experts in inclusive education and creating safer spaces for children, particularly children with disabilities. We focus on community-based rehab, inclusive education and disability support. We're also pioneers of new technology, particularly in disability screening, to ensure that children aren't left behind. And we've supported over 186,000 children in the last 3 years. A little bit about Overexposed and where it sits. It's situated in this our wider sort of shifting the power strategy as an organisation that we've had for the past sort of 5 years and ongoing. So part of that has been to hire an Africa-based CEO for the first time earlier this year. Also ensuring our board is diverse, so we have more than 50% are Africans and more than 60% of our senior management are African as well. So Overexposed sits in this kind of wider context, part of shifting more power and control and expertise and resources to the communities that we work with and that we support. And a big part of that is in how their stories are told and how they're represented. Um, I'm just admitting a few more people in. Cool. A bit about today, the format of today's session. Sorry, just going to mute the new people that have joined. Yeah, a little bit about the format of today. So we're going through the how, the how, and the what next of the campaign. So Lucy is going to cover our why, so why we launched the campaign and why ethical and rights-based storytelling is so important. Richard is going to cover our how, so how we've changed our communications as an organisation to be in line with Overexposed. And then towards the end, I'll talk a bit about the what was the impact and then what's next for the campaign in its new phase. So the webinar is going to be an hour. We know we have quite a lot to cover and we probably won't cover everything. So we've put aside 15 minutes at the end from 11 a.m. for us to stick around and answer any questions that you might have. Feel free to put any questions in the chat throughout and then we'll come to them at the end. A few ground rules as well before we kick off. So yeah, please make sure you're muted. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and organisation. Take breaks if you need to. And please remember this is a space for reflection and collaboration, not criticism of how other people are doing things. There are no wrong questions or answers. If you have any safeguarding concerns, talk to Richard. He'll be in the chat. And then we also kindly have Clara on tech support from our side, so she'll be monitoring the chat as we go through. And I'll hand over to Lucy to talk a bit about why we've launched the campaign and to introduce herself.
Hi everyone.
It's a real pleasure to be here today. This is a topic I'm so passionate about. As Ruby's introduced me already, my name is Lucy Rollington. I work as a child and youth rights consultant, specialising in participatory rights and child rights advocacy. I've worked with some really fantastic organisations over the years, Consortium for Street Children, Amnesty International, Lumos, World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts. So a real mixed bag of organisations in the terms of how they tell stories and communicate. But I started my career in youth work and community development and human rights and education. And I talk about that career beginning because it was a real stark contrast for me, the difference between how and what we share as stories and images between both sectors. And I think that raises some awareness and interesting points about how we communicate our work when we hold the relationships directly as to when we don't. And that is often the case with international work, which I think is predominantly the organisations that are here today. So ethical storytelling matters to me on a professional level, of course, but also on a personal and a political level. And I think that we have a choice and we have a responsibility in our field to make sure that our values span across all the areas of our work, maybe not just our programmings. So yes, as Ruby mentioned, I worked on this campaign launch back in 2022 with the incredible Vicky Ferguson, who I'm sure some of you are aware of in the room. And I'm delighted to be back supporting Chance for Childhood with the relaunch today. But before I get into the details of that, next slide, please. So you may have noticed that Ruby introduced the two of us today with some pictures of ourselves. And this was not just a ploy to show you how cute Ruby was or how decent and sizable my fringe was at that age. It's more about the nature of what we're talking about today. You know, the very kind of physical putting ourselves into the picture and with that intentional space. So I just want to reflect on some questions about the process of this. In asking for these photos, I want us to consider some things. Could either of us have said no? What photos did we choose to represent ourselves? Did it add anything to the introduction? Has it added anything to the content of today's session? Have you learned anything about any one of us other than the size of my fringe and potentially my head in that photo as a result of using, you know, those images? So how might Ruby feel if I then stored that image that she sent me on my computer? And the next time I spoke about ethical storytelling, I used it. Or perhaps I used it in a different context outside of ethical storytelling or outside of the conversations that we've just had. How would the two of us feel if every single time we had to introduce ourselves as adults, as professional, this was the photo that people remembered, or this was the photo that we had to use? Um, are we comfortable now that any one of you can take a screenshot? This session is recorded and Ruby's asked permissions for that. It's likely going to be uploaded, I think, to YouTube. Are we okay with the fact that these two images, we don't really have control over how they're used and perceived at that point? Um, the point is, in doing this, is that we did have a choice and agency about this, and we spoke about it. And I think that's illustrated by the fact that the wonderful Richard, who's one of our speakers today, said, "No, I don't like photos of me. I'm not using it." So we did have a choice and agency of this. But if you look at your organisational website now, or you look at your organisational comms, it won't take you very long to find a picture of a child, like identifiable or not. Did they have the same choice and the same agency in that photo getting to where it got to? And are your values, your organisational values, represented in your storytelling as well? So yeah, it's a reminder to put ourselves in the picture. It's also a reminder that behind every story and every image that we use, there's a real person in all of their complexity and their context. It's exactly these types of conversations that led to the launch of the Overexposed campaign in 2022, September 2022. And I want to show you the campaign video of that just to set the scene.
I have a question. What is a segmented multi-channel donation campaign? I have a question. Why is my picture on social media profiles that aren't mine? I have another question. Why is it okay for my image to be published all over the internet when most parents will not allow it? Just one more question. Is that okay? Is that ethical? Is that fair?
Thank you, Ruby. I hope everyone could hear that as well. Sometimes it's difficult with videos, but we can link that as well into the chat. So the questions and the conversation that I hope the introduction and that video has raised is covering some of the key themes that we're going to attempt to go over today. So the Overexposed campaign and pledges, and there are 5 of the pledges. We'll go into them a bit later. It's built around these themes of rights, of dignity, of privacy, of safety, of context, and of power. And I think it's fundamentally a conversation. That's what we tried to start with the campaign, and that's what we're continuing today. Even if that's the beginning for you of this conversation and thinking things differently, or you're kind of further along in your journey of shifting how you practice storytelling and image use. It's also fundamentally about listening to the children and young people that we work with and the communities that they're in, and giving them the space to tell us about the challenges they face when it comes to telling their stories. So in 2022, there were 22 pledges of organisations and supporting organisations who signed the pledge. And I think some people are here today, which is really exciting. And I hope maybe as a result of this conversation that we have today and the continuation of that we'll end up getting some more pledges as well. There's a real mix of organisations in here. It's donors, it's organisations. I think we have some content creators as well. And they've done all sorts of amazing work in terms of how they have actualised the Overexposed pledge. So as the video says, Chance for Childhood took the plunge and took out identifiable images of children. Not every pledge has done that, but they've done some really interesting participatory storytelling work. They've lent more into illustrations. They've built it into their safeguarding policies. They've thought about what they ask grantees and for as part of their kind of grant conditions and whether they want those, what types of photos and videos, etc. So there's lots of different ways in which they've kind of embodied this. And we do have a Q&A later. So for the ones that have signed the pledge and wouldn't mind maybe asking a question on that, then I hope I haven't put you on the spot there, but perhaps that's a good opportunity to do so. So it's not just hearing from Chance for Childhood and myself. So yeah, it's been 3 years since we've launched it. I think now's the time to continue that conversation, shift it from kind of an internal process and reflection for Chance for Childhood, and yeah, continue this conversation that's supported, focused on learning and community-based. So before I get into some of the kind of content and the themes, I just want to finish on the next slide and the quote. So Boki is the co-founder of Glad's House Kenya, based in Mombasa. They're one of Chance for Childhood's partners, and they also initiated that in that partnership and in that kind of power shift sphere with Chance for Childhood, and were really instrumental in making that happen and launching the Overexposed campaign. So they shifted the way that they started to tell stories and the images that they use of the children that they work with back in 2017, and had been having these kind of conversations before that. And I love this quote. You might take a picture of a child when they're 9 years old, but what happens when they see it when they're 16? That image will haunt them forever. Children will be defined for the rest of their lives by a moment in time. The context in which Glad's House work is with street-connected children and also children within the community. And Boki speaks about lots of examples of how they perhaps used an image of a child, and then when that child had grown up, because they do such long time work, they look back on it and they weren't comfortable with it. It was perhaps the worst moment in that child's life. He has a story about the pictures that he took when a child who'd stolen a phone kind of suffered from a mob justice and was badly beaten. As part of an advocacy perspective, they took photos of that child with that child's permission, but later the physical copies of that photos was taken from the office, and it really is just an example of, that's a physical photo that they lost control of. When we start to use stuff on the internet, it can move and it can change in different directions. So I think this quote is, and the way that Boki speaks about this is really poignant. And there's a blog on that. He's been part of the launch webinars as well back in 2022. I just wanted to finish on that before we start to explore some of the key themes of the campaign. So if I can go to the next slide. We want to preference this is there's lots of different people in the room, and we're not exactly sure at what point you're kind of entering this conversation at, or what context you necessarily work in, including from a risk and a vulnerability point of view. So we wanted to use some of the time today to go over some of the key themes that were foundational to the Overexposed campaign pledges. And it might feel a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of those concepts, but I want to reassure you that there are loads of already created learning and resources, tools, which we will be sharing. We obviously have the Q&A, and Ruby will be going over all the ways in which the conversation and chance for childhood support to you in this will not stop here. So we talk a lot, next slide please, about how we want storytelling and image use to be child-centred. So for those who are not familiar with what a child-centred approach is, although I imagine based on who's here today, a lot of you already work in a child-centred approach. No child or child experience is the same. We should therefore not treat all children the same. Each has his and her story and experiences to tell, and there's no one-size-solution fits all. So Chance for Childhood have applied that child-centred approach to storytelling, making it fundamental to safeguarding and, in their storytelling, promoting the welfare of every child. It's about keeping them at the centre of focus when making decisions about their lives and working in partnership with them and their families, and that includes and doesn't stop at programming. It also means how you then talk about your programming and your impact past that. We also talk about rights-based approaches, which is the next slide. And week one of the campaign pledges really dives deep on the child rights sector and provides loads of resources and kind of background if you're not already working in this way. I think there'll be some rights-based organisations working in the human rights space. But we wanted to include this because we're going to talk about child rights a lot within these conversations. So every child in our lives, every child that we work with has all the same human rights as you and I do, simply by value of being human. And they're contained under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So children have access to all of those rights that we do. It sometimes there's a bit of a misconception that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, so the UNCRC, is where their rights are contained, rather than having both of these kind of legal frameworks. The UNCRC applies most of those rights to the context of children and gives them, additional protections as a result of, their status. So we talk about this as a rights-based approach, and I've pulled up, there's 54 articles in the UNCRC. Article 2, non-discrimination, Article 3, best interests of the child, Article 6, life, survival and development, and Article 12, respect for the views of the child, are founding principles of the UNCRC, and they also are like the four fundamentals to what we call a rights-based approach as captured by UNICEF, I think. I've also pulled out Article 16, right to privacy, and Article 17, access to information from the media in here, because that's directly talking about children's right to privacy, and the ending of this talks about harm to their reputation. And when we're talking about Article 17, access to information from the media, every child has the right to reliable information from a variety of sources, which probably includes us. And we should encourage the media to provide information that children can understand. So I think that's, relevant to the stories that we tell and the context that we're talking in now. There's three P's of child rights: protection, provision, and participation. The majority of the articles fall under child protection, the provision of things like education. But last but no means least, participation. There's a fewer rights that talk about kind of legal and political protections for children, but they do exist. And Article 12, this respect for the views of the child and their right to express their views and feelings, is really fundamental to a child rights approach. There's also a concept about interdependence and indivisibility in human rights. And that basically means that no one right is more important than another. Not one trumps another, and they all are interdependent and all interconnected. And you can't have one without the other. And I talk about this now because I think it's really relevant to storytelling in the sense of perhaps your organization is realizing children's rights in an area, protection, education, conflict. But that doesn't then mean we can ignore Article 16 on the right to privacy, or ignore Article 17 about how we communicate them, or children's participation in that. They're all the same, and they all need to be respected the same. You know, your program might be supporting them to realise their right to education, but when you use their photo in your annual report, what about their right to privacy, their right to participate in decisions that affect their lives or harm their reputation, when a case study is used of perhaps the worst moment in their lives? Also, lastly, on this, and this is very quick on the child rights sector, Article 3 of best interest of the child. And I think that's so fundamental. All the decisions that we make should be in the best interest of that child. And that should be from a child-centered perspective as well. So not for every child, but for that child. And I think a good question to ask us in this context is, the story that you've told, the image that you used, is that in the best interest of that child in particular? Or is it in the best interest of your communications plan? And I think that's something that's kind of some of the uncomfortable questions that we should be asking ourselves as part of this. So the next slide, please. I wanted to include this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, who was very fundamental in putting together the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There was a lot of women involved in putting that together, but you probably won't hear that much about them. And in a lot of human rights education that I've done, particularly with young people, I think it's a really good quote to kind of ground us. When I talk about legal instruments and articles, if you're not familiar with them, they can seem hypothetical or not relevant necessarily to the work that you do. Whereas I really like this quote, where after all do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map to the world. And I like to come back to this because I really do have a lot of faith in our sector. I believe that we've got the resources, we've got the creativity, and we've got the will to change, to become sector leaders in the area of ethical storytelling, and kind of really live our values in all areas of our life. And that maybe it's a really small decision for your organisation to work in perhaps a more rights-based way, but that is, you know, enacting human rights, and that is the small places in which they can take part. Next slide, please. I wanted to use like a real life example, so that this doesn't seem quite removed. Could people react in the chat with a thumbs up if you recognise this photo? Okay. In the chat, does anybody know the name of the photographer of this photo? Okay, we've got a few. Steve Curry. Does anybody know the name? Yeah, Steve McCurry. Does anybody know the name of this girl, other than, as the portrait was called, the Afghan girl? There's a couple of no's, and then I'm gonna take the silence of, yes, someone knows. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the girl in this photo, and this photo was taken in 1985, which is 40 years ago, everybody, just to make us feel old, is Sharbat Gula. and the photograph is known as the Afghan girl. It was taken while she was in Pakistan as a refugee from the Afghan-Soviet War. And when she was later found and she talks about this photo, she says, "It made me famous, but it also led to my imprisonment." I'm going to tell you the story of how this photo was taken. And as I do so, I'm trying to apply it to the concepts that we just went over before. So from a rights-based perspective and from a child-centered perspective. So Steve McCurry entered Shabat's classroom. It was an all girls school set up in a refugee camp. He'd seen Shabat. He'd seen her like really like green eyes, and she was really striking as well. And he knew that he wanted to take her photo. He instructed the teacher to allow him to photograph Shabat alone. And then he instructed her to remove her veil, and her hands were covering her face. So he instructed her to remove them as well. He didn't ask for a name, so he didn't know it until 2002. He didn't ask for permission to take the photograph. He also didn't ask for the permissions of her father, which in this cultural context was more appropriate. It was also very inappropriate for him to be alone with a young girl there as well. So this photo became known for people that aren't familiar. It became an iconic photo. It was representing the fear in the eyes of the Afghan refugees at the time. And it also represents her anger and her resilience as well. It came to be known, I think, from National Geographic also to the plight of refugees is how they've phrased it as well. And there are many other photos in this example that I could have used that perhaps don't lean into that anger, that resilience, that power that she does have in this photo. There's Fantim Kumfuk, the napalm girl. There's the struggling girl that's now in South Sudan. You might be familiar with some of these photos. There's the photo of Aylan Kurdi, the Syrian boy in 2015. So I've used this example because it's that shift that we saw in the sector. She's not necessarily smiling, but she's not necessarily in distress. So it could be seen as better than some of those other kind of iconic photos from photojournalism. But I think it's interesting. Perhaps it represents not her fear of the situation that her in, but her fear and her anger about the stranger that's come and taken a photo of her. So Steve McCurry, as you probably know, he made thousands, as did National Geographic, from this photo. We didn't know her name until 2002, as I've mentioned. She was arrested in 2016 and she was deported from Pakistan. She blames the photograph for this because she was now a famous person. She was now a high-profile female. I believe now, as of the 2021 Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, she has asylum as a high-profile female, I think in Italy, I believe. There's an article around this time of Steve McCurry talking about how we should not name or discuss Shabat in 2021 to protect her. So, next slide, please. There are obvious and really unsettling power dynamics in this story. And I'm not saying this is the process by which any of our organisations are collecting their communications material. Although what I would say is that if you're using stock images or you haven't created the content yourself, you actually might not know that. And that's something that we need to consider. I think it's a really useful exercise to start thinking about what this photo and this story can tell us about ethical storytelling. And I know that the context of photojournalism and what we use are different, but what about Shabat's right to dignity, to privacy, to information and protection from harm? If a child-centered and a child rights approach had been applied here, would this photograph have even been taken in the first place? And given the shift in kind of perception of the refugee situation at that time, was it worth it? Would we have known more about her life and her context if we'd asked about that, if Stephen McCurry had asked about that? If an informed consent process had taken place with Shabat or her father, could that have foreseen all of the consequences of the photo 40 years later? Week 2 of the Overexposed pledge talks exactly about the limitations of informed consent processes for this reason. And I think that's a really interesting nuance that we need to grapple with. So, I think this photo, it captures a moment in time, as many of our stories and our images that we use do, but it shaped her life for years. And that's exactly what Boki was saying as well. So again, we know that this context is different, but the context that Boki's working in from Glad South Kenya also talks about that shaping children's lives for years to come. And the next slide, we've come up with quite a lot of these. These are some of the main themes of the Overexposed campaign and some of the areas we want to start these conversations about. We don't have all the answers. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but we're thinking about choice and agency. We're thinking about identity and context. We're thinking about consent and risk. And ultimately, we're thinking about power. And the power we hold as adults making these decisions around what images and what stories we tell of children. So, on risk, because I think it's really important to embed our understanding of storytelling from a safeguarding perspective as well. We'll go to the next section of the webinar, where we're going to talk about risk specifically and safeguarding and ethical storytelling. So we're using Menti. I think that link and the code will be placed in the chat for you to follow. You can also take a photograph of that QR code, and that will take you directly to the Menti on your phone or on a new tab. And then we've got a question in there. So we're asking you just to share, because I know I've been speaking a lot so far. We'd love to hear from you. What potential risks do children and young people in your organisation support face when they have their photos taken and their stories shared? If you don't work with children and young people, then talk about the communities that you work with in general. But if we could change screens just so we can start to see the word cloud come together, that would be great.
I'm just going to pop the link in the chat.
Okay. Also, if Menti isn't working for you or you've got low bandwidth, then we'll put the question up on the screen, we'll put it in the chat, and then you can just answer in the chat as well. So the question is, what potential risks do children and young people in your organisations face when having their photos taken and their stories shared? So we've got privacy. Someone's just asked whether we can show the QR code again. Is that doable, Ruby, to dip back into that?
On the screen in the bottom left corner, you should be able to scan that.
Okay, so we've got lots of really interesting answers, and the ones that are coming up larger are when that answer's been repeated by people that are contributing. Privacy, safety, stereotyping, misrepresentation, can expose their location, stigmatization, harmful stereotypes, stolen identity, teasing. Yeah, these are really interesting. Keep them coming. Lost dignity. I think that's dignity is coming up quite a bit here. We've got backlash, harmful stereotypes. Great. Okay. All right. That slowed down a bit, but yeah, some real key themes coming through there. A few more coming through. Exploitation, shame. Okay. Thank you. I think that slowed down, so we'll go on to the next slide, which might take us a little second to go through. So yeah, I think it's quite clear from that really short exercise that we're really aware of some of the risks and the safeguarding issues that are present within our storytelling, and what we might need to mitigate in order to make that more ethical. We talked about trauma and re-traumatization there. You know, in collecting images and also collecting stories, often there are, as I've said, the kind of worst moment in a child or a person's life. Are we well equipped enough to ensure that they're not being re-traumatized at the point of that story collection, or when they see it later, as we've mentioned before? Is there a safe adult? Is there check-in processes after that? Can we always guarantee that even if they have the right to withdraw their story in the image, that we can execute that as well? There were some of these that came through in the chat as well. Assumptions from the community and added attention from other members in the community. This was really important from our partners, and we had so many stories coming through when we created the Overexposed campaign about how if you then become the feature on the charity website or the annual report, it can be presumed that you're having potentially some favourable treatment or maybe some transference of money, which can be damaging for community members' reputations. In addition to that as well, and this is applicable to a lot of different contexts, but also like an advocacy and an activism context, sharing opinions and experiences that are negative towards duty bearers. Maybe that's parents, maybe that's a school, maybe that's a government. We need to safeguard and protect individuals when they're sharing their stories from any kind of backlash that they might face, particularly as a result of this kind of negative opinions. We talked about disclosure of information in their situations and locations. This is a real balance as well, because something that we've spoken about in the ethical storytelling setting is that using images or stories without that context, you see it all the time where an image perhaps of a child in Ethiopia and it's used for a context in South Africa, for example. We want to, contextualize and be accurate and truthful in our portrayal, but we do need to balance that with the disclosure of information and the situation location. And this might seem quite dramatic, but this really is a big deal. Like, do we know who is accessing our websites, our stories? There was an organization that I worked for who published loads of different research pieces, and they were accessed by all of the network members. And it was only through working out the search terms that people were finding, particularly research pieces about child sexual exploitation, that we realized that they can access those research pieces which talk explicitly about the areas that children who were where there was child sexual exploitation actually were located. So I don't want to be too dark, but I think about the worst possible scenario, and in some contexts that is happening. Data not being safely stored. We talked about that physical photo that Boki mentioned, but also on our systems. Are they up to date? Are we GDPR compliant in Europe? Is that for all of the different offices? Who has access to your Google Drives, to your Microsoft Teams? Thinking about this from a data protection point of view, but also about what the consequences of not storing them correctly. I don't think we spoke about this potentially in the Word Cloud, but the misuse of images in other contexts. So an organisation that was part of the original launch in Uganda was talking about how they'd taken a photo of a child in their context. They'd done an informed consent process. The child liked the photo. They were happy with it. They were happy with the story. And then once they put it on the internet, you lose control. Another organisation used that picture of that child in their own publications, and this was a publication about child soldiers. So the original child was not a child soldier, and that's a really dangerous misrepresentation of their context that can have stigma, of course, but a dangerous consequences for that child. And even though that organisation had gone through all of those processes and they've really thought about this, they couldn't control what that was. And then there's a really serious issue of the breakdown of your relationship. So much of our work with children and young people is based on trust, and perhaps if their image, their story is misrepresented, it's not factually correct, it's not positive, it doesn't feel like their own or that they own it. Breaking that trusted relationship is a real risk, and I think it's something that we don't think about as often. Partially because children and young people we work with maybe don't see the stories, and they don't see how their image and their stories are used, which is perhaps part of the problem, and that kind of lack of feedback loop, which a participatory approach can kind of combat. And the consequences of misrepresentation as well. Devaluing our work in all of its complexities and nuances. We know that the contexts that we work in are really complicated, but we oversimplify them to pull in donors because of a word count, for example. What are the kind of, the historical implications of constantly misrepresenting things in that area? And I think before we talk about some emerging risk as well, and I know I'm a little bit over time, I just want to sort of talk about how I think we need to realize that good and best intentions don't always buffer against the very real harms that we can cause, and we've discussed about today. And that when we use this kind of one-dimensional images of children and young people and the communities that you work with. So yes, that's quite a heavy section. The reason, sorry, can we go on the next slide? So in the past 3 years, the sector has changed massively in so many different ways that we could spend a whole hour talking about. I think that OpenAI first published the ChatGPT prototype in November 2022, so 2 months after Overexposed was launched. But yeah, these 3 things I think are emerging risks in the last 3 years that was partly why we wanted to make this decision of bringing this conversation back and supporting organisations with this learning. Reputationally, this is a really growing conversation, and it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to kind of die out, and people won't think about it. Everyone was kind of having their conversations internally when we launched Overexposed, and it was unique in the sense of we brought it all together. But that has just grown and grown and grown. I think there will be a point where perhaps it will be a reputational issue if we're not considering the risks of the way in which we tell stories or the ethics behind it, or a rights-based approach. I love this because it's the area that I work in, a rise in really meaningful children and young people's participation and acknowledgement of their participatory rights. And the more we do that, the more we'll have to think about how we can work with children and young people to actually tell their stories. And if we have this power shift, what might they say about their lives, about their context, about the impacts of your program if we give them the power? One thing I just wanted to say on this as well is the non-identifiable photos was really appropriate for Chance for Childhood. But if you're working in participatory ways with children and young people, particularly advocacy, particularly with activists, it might be that they want to be at the front of their stories. And that's a kind of conversation around informed consent as well. And a big thing, a very, very big thing, is artificial intelligence and image generation, which wasn't really a thing when we launched this 3 years ago. If I can have the next slide. So none of these images are real. And it's interesting because some of what we've talked about is how all of the children in these photos are real, and we need to think about putting ourselves in the picture. And yet now we're faced with this other context where, you know, these children and these adults in these photos are not real. Pledge 3 of the Overexposed campaign also talks about positive and strength-based language. And I think that's important when we talk about the AI image generation, because whilst these aren't real, they're all pulled from data sets on the internet, from stock images, from the images that perhaps our sector has been sharing, from these narratives. And it's then amalgamated them and represented these things in this way. And I think that the stock images, the image generation, they strongly influence the way that a non-expert audience will think about these issues and the topics that they illustrate. And there's a worrying amount of research. They're not great. There's some, I will say some AI image generation sites are a little bit better, but I will link you in the next slide there's a Guardian article which came out a couple of weeks ago, particularly on this. And I think, I don't want to get the company wrong, but they were asked about the ethics of this and they didn't see any problem with that at all. So earlier in this year, there was the Lancet article about AI reproduction in global health visuals, and then there was this Guardian article which came out this month. And this is part of the thing that I'm talking about, this being a real growing conversation. I think the misleading nature and the unhelpful nature of AI image generation is why at Chance for Childhood we want to have this conversation, and we don't have all the answers. But next slide, please. I think it was really important to acknowledge and add into the guidelines that they don't use AI image generation to circumvent any of the guidelines for the exact reasons that we've been talking about as well. So I'm a little bit over time, but I just want to finish talking about, real stories created with ethics built in, avoiding stereotypes, grounded in informed contextual consent. I think they're only going to grow in importance. So it's great that you're all here today. I think this is our opportunity to be leaders. And on leadership, I want to pass over to Richard and the CC staff to talk about their approach, all the alternatives that they've used, and how they've mitigated some of the very, very real risks that we've spoken about in this section today.
All right. Thank you very much, Lucy, for sharing those insights. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being part of this critical discussion today. So I am Richard Opoku, the Inclusion and Safeguarding Lead, and also the Senior Program Manager in Ghana. Now, since the launch of the Overexposed campaign in 2022, Chance for Childhood has been leading a crucial shift in how the international, development and humanitarian sector approaches storytelling, particularly when it involves children. Now, through this campaign, we set out to promote more ethical and respectful storytelling that safeguards children's dignity, rights, and privacy. Now, over the past 3 years, this commitment has transformed how we tell our stories, from the language that we use to the way we capture and share images and videos of children across our programs. We recognize that, images remain a powerful part of storytelling. They bring our work to life and help audiences to connect emotionally with the people and the communities that we are serving. Our goal, therefore, is not to stop taking images, but to ensure that every image is captured and shared vertically. Now, as part of this transformation, we made 5 key pledges that guide everything that we do, as part of capturing images and sharing our stories, especially when it involves children. So, Ruby, please, let's go to the the pledges. So quickly, let me run you through the pledges that we are adhering to. So one is that I will prioritize the rights, well-being, dignity, privacy, and agency of every child whose story or image I engage with wherever they are in the world. So this is the one of the pledges that we are complying with. Please, let's move on because of time. So two, I recognize that informed consent is complex, may evolve over time, and is not always possible. And I will respect this in all storytelling decisions. So as Lucy, shared some examples. Yes, sometimes, consent can even lead to certain, it can lead to certain decisions, especially when you take the image of a child and then later they say that, no, I didn't want this image to be on the internet or to be shared on, this platform. Then that can raise a lot of issues. So that's, why consent, can be complex at times. Please, let's move on. So pledge number 3, I will only share or reshare child-centered stories using positive strength-based language that upholds the child's humanity and avoids perpetuating negative stereotypes. So this is the 3rd pledge that we uphold to. Please, let's move on. The 4th one says that I will pause and reflect before sharing any story or image of a child, asking whether it could put them at risk or cause harm now or in the future. So again, this is something that we need to also reflect on if we are taking or sharing images of children. Please, let's see the last one. And I will take responsibility for the power I hold in collecting, sharing, and amplifying children's stories. And I will encourage others to do the same with care and dignity. So these are the five pledges that we comply or we adhere to. And these pledges have significantly reshaped how we approach photography and videography in our project. And as you can see, maybe with the exception of the childhood photos that Ruby and Lucy, consented to share for the purpose of this presentation or discussion, all the images that we presented, complied with these five guidelines. But let me now share more examples of how we've been working around this in practice. So we never share identified images of children. That means no recognizable faces. Instead, we use creative and respectful alternatives, such as the images that you see on the screen. So the first one is that we show images or images showing only the backs, of children. So the first photo on your left, the two, children. So I mean, these are some of the images that we are capturing. And then side profiles, provided no defining features are visible. So the second photo on your right. So that is what I'm talking about. And then we can also use, or we are using wide shots where children are unrecognizable or their faces are naturally obscured. So the photos, at the bottom, they are also, acceptable. We do not blur, children's faces. If a child is still recognizable, the image, we don't use that image. And then we do not show donors or partners or visiting staff, directly interacting with children in our projects. Any partner images must comply with the guidelines that we just went through. And then we use images and videos that are authentic and truthful, captured in context, not staged, cropped, edited, to misrepresent reality. Yes, reality. And then it is also acceptable to show the local staff of CFC, supporting the children in our project. That is also acceptable. And then finally, we never use real names of project participants, whether children or adults, in any external, communication. But how have we been complying with these guidelines? It's very simple: training. So we train our staff, to shift from the traditional way of showing children's faces to, complying with these guidelines, and also to ensure that stories and the visuals that we collect focus on strength, dignity, and resilience rather than pity or vulnerability. But I mean, definitely these changes have deeply influenced the way we communicate as an organization, from campaigns to donor engagement and public, story telling. Now, to share more about how this transition has shaped our communications and fundraising outcomes, I would like to invite Ruby to speak, about the impact. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I will quickly summarize this part about impact. We always get asked, I think it's always the first question that we get asked, is how did this change, taking children's faces out in particular, how did that impact our fundraising? But as you can see, our fundraising has gone up, continues to rise despite all the current pressures and challenges in our sector. And actually, we've seen some really positive impacts on donors that have invited us to speak about the campaign. And we kind of see it, well, it is now a sort of USP for the organisation. It's something we're really proud of. And we think it makes us more attractive and appealing as a potential organisation to fund. To follow these sort of moral guidelines. So yeah, it's we can obviously talk more in depth about this in the Q&A if anyone's interested in like the journey and how we navigated losing a lot of our imagery overnight. I think we lost literally about 90% of our images overnight when we took the faces out. But yeah, it's been a positive journey, and we can talk more in depth about that. Yeah, in the interest of time, I will skip on and just talk a little bit about what's next for this new phase of the campaign. So I think we've put in the chat where you can sign up to the pledge, but the pledge essentially means signing up to those 5 principles that Richard just talked through. So you can do this as an individual. We recognize that you might not always get the buy-in from like a whole organization to sign up, but obviously we can help you also when it comes to sort of advocating internally for it. So you can take the pledge as an individual or as an organization. You can also join our community of practice. Next year we'll sort of be setting up sessions kind of like this where we'll be sharing best practice and discussing like new challenges. I think AI will probably come up as quite a big topic in the sector. So yeah, watch out for those. We also have a resource hub on our website. Please send us any recommendations or anything you've seen as well that you think should be on there or you want to talk to us about. You can also get in touch. We have an overexposed inbox. The address is there. Feel free to reach out. And I know we're coming up to 11, so we have a couple of quick questions we would love you to answer. They should pop up on your screen if I can get it to work. Hopefully a couple of little questions have popped up for you. Yeah, I can see Lucy nodding. If they don't, then they're also on the screen. But yeah, we would love to know what one thing you could or you will take away from the session today. And then also if there's anything we could help you when it comes to implementing that learning at your organization. I'll leave that up for a minute. I know some people might need to drop off as it's 11 and you might have other meetings, but us three, Richard, Lucy and I are going to stick around for 15 minutes to answer some questions. So yeah, would love you to stay if you can. Yeah, we're here to answer any questions. I know there's been a few in the chat, so we can get to those. If you do have questions but you need to drop off, we can also follow up via email afterwards. Actually, I'll leave those questions up just in case you're still answering. Oh, see a few answers coming in. They're also anonymous. I should have mentioned so. Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll leave that up for anyone that wants to carry on answering, but we can jump into our Q&A if yeah, we're ready. Lara, is there any questions in the chat that have come up throughout the meeting?
From Megan. Can you hear me okay? There's one from Megan.
Oh yeah, I can hear.
What are the thoughts of using identifiable imagery of adults in these contexts? Does the pledge solely relate to the images of children due to informed consent?
I can take that one if you want, and then Richard, you can talk about your process with informed consent and adults.
Yeah.
So I think that it really as a the kind of preference in a lot of what we're talking about, it really depends on on your context and the kind of risk of that context as well. So I think that because Chance for Childhood works predominantly with children, and so the organisations that I've worked before, particularly Consortium for Street Children, who are on the call today, our process is kind of applied to children that are usually at a higher risk than others. But I think that the adult question is really interesting, and I would advise using an informed consent process with adults as well, not just kind of having that cutoff point at 18 and then thinking that adults might not have the same risks because I think they're apparent. Also the same feelings about an image being used. There's obviously the same power dynamic if about the scenario in which you're taking that kind of photo or that story from an adult. Can that adult say no if you're the only provider of, I don't know, education for their child in a remote area? That there's a lot of the risks, a lot of the ethics apply to adults as well. And that's not to kind of say that any of the contexts that we work with are inherently vulnerable. But I think about it from myself. Would I want someone to just use an image of me out and about and without kind of my permissions and me knowing about it? I don't think I would. And there's some exercises within the pledges as well for team members to kind of talk about this. So I think one of the exercises was about bringing a photo of yourself as a kid or as an adult that you're actually really embarrassed about, or one that you just don't like. And then how would you feel about that being in different spaces or attached to yourself kind of professionally? So I don't think it does just apply to children and young people, but it does for Chance for Childhood context just because of their area of work. Richard, do you want to talk about that in terms of how you've actualized it at Chance for Childhood?
No, I mean, definitely. So just to add, yeah, so when it comes to showing no faces, so that one is strictly for children, right? Because children cannot consent themselves, they need their parents or a guidance to do that. So that's why we have decided. So if you take me, my childhood photo today, and then you put it on the internet, and I grew up and I said, I don't want my photo to be on the internet. Though my parent or my guardian has consented to, it can bring a lot of issues. So that's why we have taken this decision not to, show faces of children. But of course, as an adult, I can consent for myself, whether I want my face to be on the internet or in any publication. So yes, when we are dealing with adults, we do get their consent, and those who feel comfortable for their images to be shown, we do that. So yes, maybe that's what I can I can add. Okay.
There was another comment about AI and children's voices. It's not framed as a question, but a really interesting comment if anyone wants to have a read of that. But I'll go on to the next question. How about if the image is of a happy, clean, dignified, and engaged child, nothing portraying them in any negative light? And that's from Danielle.
I'll go, and then for Ruby, Richard, do come in. I think that we've definitely seen kind of a sector shift. Previously, some of the images that I mentioned, the struggling girl in Sudan, the napalm girl, the Aylan Kurdi, for example, like these key images that all of us will kind of, there'll be one that's really kind of triggered a bit of a change in you. We as a sector, I don't think there's many organisations that tend to use images of children that perhaps where they're in distress or they're compromised or perhaps they're unclean, as you mentioned. In the street connected children's sector, there used to be lots of photos of children sleeping on the streets to kind of illustrate a point, but a sleeping child can't consent. But I do think we've seen this sector shift. So we don't kind of use those images as much as we tend to do the stories, and it's happy children, for example, as you've mentioned. But the risks still apply. the ethics of that still apply. The context in which you're talking about still apply. I see it a lot, say, for example, on LinkedIn, where a stock image is used of a happy child, for example, and the context that they're talking about might be something that is a lot darker, like child sexual exploitation. So I think I wouldn't. I think you need to interrogate what works for your organisation, and as we've spoken about, like this was right for Chance for Childhood or right for other organisations. It might be that your risk threshold and you're happy with kind of using those images. But I personally would say it doesn't counter the ethics and the risk that we've talked about, just because the nature of the photo is different from what we've kind of previously used. And in theory, it seems better.
Yeah, just to add, I think it's that thing of like you just don't know where it's going to end up like once it's out there. And even like that photo or the photos we shared of ourselves, you know, as fine, like that was also taken in a happy situation, but like the one of me, but I also wouldn't want that to be everywhere or, to be used in like, in a report or something, because it's, yeah, it's about context. Um, yeah, and I think like I see a lot of parents online at the moment that don't want to share their children, and that's just, they're also in perfectly safe and happy like situations, but it's just, not having their faces out there because in the future, they might not be happy with that. So yeah, it's just thinking about where things are going to end up and how permanent the internet is, I guess.
We've got another question from Rachel. In what situations should I avoid taking photos of children, even with consent?
I feel like that's I guess it's something you have to decide as like an organization or maybe even on a case by case basis. I think um, like Lucy was saying, we taking out faces works for us, and that's based on like the children that we support because they tend to be in quite vulnerable situations, or yeah, so that works for us, but it might not work for everyone. And like, yeah, I think sometimes it's what works for your organization. Um, yeah, Lucy, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think that a lot of organisations that then took the pledge a few years ago had already like an idea about the images they wanted to use, and part of that sometimes falls in under safeguarding, but part of that can fall under like brand guidelines or language guidelines in the images that you use. So I think some of those organisations try to unify what their comms team was saying and then what their kind of programs team was saying. So it really does depend on your context. As I mentioned in the street connected children context, CSC, before they decided to not use identifiable images of children, they wouldn't take a photo of a child that was asleep on the streets. They wouldn't use a stock image, without context, and they wouldn't use an image of a child that's partially dressed, for example. They'd already got these kind of guidelines. So I think it does depend on context and the risk that you're working with. But it's interesting. I would have that conversation with the communities, and if you're working with children, with people, with them, like what were they comfortable with, and they kind of build it up through that, or see other organisations that do the type of work that you do, and whether they have any kind of guidelines around it. But it's quite a hard question to say without knowing what kind of context you are coming from. And I think a lot of it probably is personal opinion as well. I think a good exercise is to put yourself in that situation. Would you want a photo of yourself in that context? Would you want a photo of the children in your life in that context as well? And that's a great point that Ruby made. Like parents as well online are thinking differently about how they share images of their children, and a child and rights and a child-centered based approach means that applies to every child, not just your own. So really kind of thinking about what you might be comfortable with and then applying that to the people that you work with and for.
Just
We have one question that's been answered by Sian in the chat just about challenges to implementing overexposed across the organisation. So I'll move over that one because that's been answered in the chat. We have. So there's one here sort of relating to what you were just talking about. I wonder when we say some photos of children are allowed and some are not, it brings the question on boundaries and how those boundaries are defined, and those that are left to interpretation can be very easily blurred. Meant to frame this as a question on how do you balance that?
I guess I can answer a little bit from the Chance for Childhood side. Like, it is definitely a conversation, and like there isn't like a science or like there's no science behind it. Like, sometimes we have discussions in our team whether a photo is acceptable, and sometimes we'll have different opinions. Sometimes, like when it's a side profile, and we've been talking like about how much of a profile can you show before it's identifiable, like in it, and people have different opinions on that. So yeah, I think it's always about you have to discuss internally and just come up with what works for you. We've been developing some new guidelines, or we have developed some new guidelines at the moment, which I could share with you, and they kind of go into a bit more detail around the boundaries, or that we've put in place as an organization. But yeah, it's definitely you do have to define. I think you have to define those boundaries as an organization and decide what works for you.
Yeah, I think I probably sound like a broken record, but I will say it again, like it depends on the context as well. I think that when you work in more participatory ways with children and young people, and perhaps they're creating images themselves or they're telling their stories, they might want to feature, and they might want to be seen within that, and that in maybe an advocacy or an activist context is important. I guess there's risks then with the activist content that you probably would need to discuss and kind of work around. But I think knowing that it's a balance and it is nuanced, and the importance of like an informed consent process, even though we know that it's not it can't always be full and it can't always mitigate everything. That kind of conversation with the subject of your photo or story, if they fully understand exactly how it's going to be used, also if they understand that that's your intention, but you might not have control over that. I think that's really interesting when you're working with populations that are further away from like the digital sphere. Perhaps they don't have a phone or much access to the internet. Do they fully understand and can they comprehend because of that like lack of proximity, what it means to lose a photo on the internet? So I think it is a balance that needs to be struck. It's good to do it from an individual basis, as the child-centered approach would want you to do, and also just kind of really explaining that informed consent process is a way of balancing that. But I think we don't always get it right.
So again, Shana's helped to answer one in the chat about impact data, so I'll skip over that one. And the last one to come through is some photographers we have worked with have included children's faces in images, even when specifically asked not to. Do you have any suggestions or guidance on how we can work with photographers to gather more high quality anonymous photos?
I can say a little bit about this, but Richard, maybe, or do you want to add? Do you want to go first, Richard?
No, good, and I'll come back.
I'll just quickly, I know we're going over the time a little bit. But yeah, I think it's about just doing really clear briefs. So we've recently done a video with a photographer, videographer, and it's just about having discussions beforehand and making sure they really understand it. And I think we even went through like the principles, the overexposed principles with them before they started the filming. And then showing them examples of, so like the examples we've shown in this presentation, like the types of photos and the kind of creative ways you can get around showing faces, just to give them like ideas, because I guess sometimes it can be a bit daunting if you've not done that before. And then I think in the past we've also had success working with like mothers who are photographers who are mothers, so because they kind of understand that maybe a little bit more about not wanting to show children's faces because they have that personal experience of from their own children. Richard, do you want to add, and then we can maybe wrap up because I know.
Yeah, I mean, yes, quickly. So yeah, so Sarah, yes, I think when we started it, we also faced similar challenges because photographers, they didn't understand why we would tell them not to show the children's faces, you know. But I think with over time, they've been able to comply with those guidelines. Um, so as Ruby said, so those specific guidelines, and I think we can, as part of our follow-ups, we can share more of those tips on what kind of photos to take. And when we engage the photographers, yeah, so sometimes they will take what we want them to do, but they will still go ahead and take the faces of the children. The only thing we have to do is to delete those that have the faces, and then we use the one that we want them to have. So I mean that's what I can add. But I think we when we share the guidelines, can provide organization with what specific things to follow when taking images.
Yeah, like I mentioned, we have some new guidelines that we'll share. So yeah, I'll send an email after this with the slides and the recording, and then all these resources we've mentioned. So like the pledge and the new guidelines we've developed. So yeah, I'll wrap up. But yeah, thank you so much for attending, and yeah, lots of great chat in the discussion in the chat box. Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.